Patrick McKenzie works at Stripe. I called him the Michael Jordan of online writing yesterday with no joke there whatsoever. Patrick is, my friend Ryan Delk called him the OG a couple weeks ago, and I think that that's absolutely true. He works at Stripe, but he's known as Patio 11, and we are going to be talking about all kinds of basically the intersection of building online businesses, software companies, and writing online. But Patrick, I think the first place that I wanted to start with you is you're really into this kooky idea of using World of Warcraft for job interviews. Why don't you talk about that?
Okay, so I did not say that I would use World of Warcraft for job interviews, but I think that it does actually have interesting training for being leaders. The way back in the day, I started writing for the internet quite a bit in 2006, and it was partly because I needed a new hobby, because from 2004 through 2006, theoretically speaking, I had a job, but my actual job was running a World of Warcraft raid guild. And funny enough, that was the only leadership experience on my resume when I became CEO of a later startup. And I very literally had on my resume for it. I ran a raid guild that had 8 direct reports, and we did budgeting meetings, et cetera, et cetera. I think that just like the internet gives people opportunities to write in ways that you don't need permission to write on the internet, and just like the open source community allows you to participate in software products without needing to be selected by gatekeepers at a software company as being like legit enough to practice software professionally, that this is going to sound crazy, but hear me out. World of Warcraft lets you run a multinational organization with 40 plus people in it without needing to be selected by an MBA or et cetera, that would traditionally gatekeep opportunities to run an organization, to do things like job interviews and hard discussions about how a person is not maybe meeting their quarterly goals. If you don't believe that World of Warcraft has quarterly goals, you haven't played World of Warcraft the right way. And things like, mediating conflicts between employees, dealing with budgets, dealing with like a very literal thing we had was a compensation strategy, both with eyes on like making people feel that their contributions to killing dragons were adequately rewarded, and with regards to like market norms on our server, and making sure that like well-equipped tanks didn't go over to competing clans, because guilds rather, because that would decrease our ability to productively kill dragons. Man, I kind of want to geek out more about World of Warcraft, but it's been many years and I don't remember all that many specifics. I just want to say, like, this is one of those like crazy ideas, which is less crazy if you think about it more. And I've thought about this particular one quite a lot.
Well, I think that this is an interesting place for us to go down, in that I think that one of the interesting things about writing online, both from a company perspective of companies looking at talent, and also for you as somebody who maybe wants to get a job, who wants to meet people, is writing online takes you from somebody who is illegible to somebody who is legible. And I think that what you're saying with World of Warcraft is there are places in the world where there's legibility, and there are signals being given to us that we are ignoring. And on both the company side, the entrepreneur side, and on the producer side, people aren't taking advantage of this, and this is low-hanging fruit.
I think I agree with that. I also think that there's sort of an is-ought distinction. Like World of Warcraft, to the extent that it is a signal, is not treated as a very, World of Warcraft, to the extent that it provides legibility into, say, management talent or realized ability to do well there, is not treated as signalful by high status employers. Whereas writing, on the other hand, is a nice arbitrage opportunity, because writing is treated as signalful by high status employers. And so, to the extent that you are like choosing, which will I do for career advancement, kill Onyxia more. Onyxia is nowhere near the end game in World of Warcraft anymore. You get the idea. Like, kill more dragons or write more essays. I would probably suggest write more essays for most people. That is sort of a thing that we come back to again and again and again in our discussions, and I think that people probably spend a little too little time thinking about. There is great value in writing just for the love of it, writing in whatever form factor works for you, writing in whatever strikes your interests. And yet, when you are doing it for career purposes, you sort of have to think of like, what is the market going to look at in such a way that it will raise their estimation of my ability to do commercial work? And there are certain form factors, like say fanfic, which don't like cause the market to reevaluate upwards your ability to do meaningful work. It would for some people, but they're few and far between. And I think that's unfortunate, and a way for those people to like get advantage from the market that they wouldn't otherwise get. But it also matters for, and we've talked about this before, like if you are quote unquote a blogger, like blogging has a poor brand within many high status employers, whereas like, you know, writing memos does not. They teach you how to write memos in MBA school. They actually don't, but people somehow think they do. And so if your output was characterized more as an essay or a memo or a guide or a market analysis, et cetera, that would be pound for pound more impactful for you than categorizing it as a blog post. And so one thing that I advocate that people do is to think of the way that their output is going to be perceived as by the user, and make relatively small changes to package it in such a way that it will be perceived as high value by default. And that might be things like, you know, you can use whatever blogging software you want, but don't call it a blog, and guilty for 10+ years here. Don't put a date on it if it's not content that's going to decay to irrelevance within 48 hours after posting it. Since you have a choice of what to write about, largely choose not to write about things that will decay to irrelevance within 48 hours. Instead, choose to write about things that will still be relevant 10 years from now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So this is a question from Matt. What did you expect when starting to write online that ended up surprising you, something that you didn't expect, where your assumptions ended up being different once you started to actually go through the craft?
Sure. So I guess that's a question both about surprise and about expectations management. Back in 2006, I didn't really have high expectations for writing online. I had, so to set the stage, I had just arrived in Japan. Oh, actually not true. I'd been there for 2.5 years at that point. I have been described as a good writer for a while at this point by teachers, but you know, being out of college, there was no longer any impetus to write large volumes and to write well. And I thought, well, writing is a useful skill, and like all skills, it decays over time if you don't use it. And my day job in Japan is not causing me to write a lot of English, and so I rather enjoy writing. It would be unfortunate if my ability here decayed to nothing. So one of the reasons that I wrote was just sort of like the bicycle for the mind / stationary bike for the craft of writing. Just, I will probably use this in the future. I don't want to decay at it. A surprising thing is that, go figure, when you spend a lot of time doing something for a while, you don't tend to plateau at that thing. You tend to get better over time, particularly if you keep pushing yourselves in different directions. Another thing that surprised me relative to expectations is that not all writing from an effort perspective is created equal with regards to achieving those goals, or for any other, for that matter, any other goals. My selection of topics for the first several years of writing online was basically, I'm just going to blog. There's that word again. I'm just going to blog about whatever's on top of my mind today. And so in a day where I did a lot of accounting, I would write about accounting. At a day where I did a lot of optimization of the performance of my Java Swing app, I would write about the performance of a Java Swing app, et cetera, et cetera. And it was very sort of scattershot. There was no rhyme or reason other than, well, if you enjoy my story, then here's the next update on it. But if you weren't like bought into the Patio 11 story, then there was no particular reason to come to my blog on any given day. Well, aside from maybe like you enjoy just the consumption of things that I write in my voice, etc. And it turned out after a couple of years, when I was looking back at both my stats and what people were telling me on, like, this is clearly your best work, is that I have a external to the craft of writing about it. I have a comparative advantage on the intersection in the Venn diagram between marketing and engineering. I'm a much better engineer than virtually all marketers, and I'm a much better marketer than virtually all engineers. And I wrote about that intersection very well. And the more I wrote about things in that intersection, the better it did. And the better I wrote sort of like long, meaty, detail heavy posts in that intersection, the better they did, versus like the 200 word, well, I'm trying to keep up my streak, so I might as well write something today to say that I wrote something on Thursday. And so after I started operationalizing that and saying, okay, I don't have a boss per se for my blog. I can still write about anything I want to write about, but when I'm thinking of things to write about, I should probably be covering stuff that's in quote unquote my beat or adjacent to it. And I should probably be writing form factors that work for me, which tend to be like 8,000 word effort posts. The people started liking the output more. I started getting better at that variety of output. There was a compounding goodness to it. I had more of a quote unquote brand developing for myself. That is not scare quotes. And that there was a virtuous cycle there of like a tighter brand for my work caused more people to like it, caused them to come back more often and to recommend it to people, caused them to like, if things adjacent to that brand were discussed online, people would inject me into the conversation even without me being in that room, et cetera, which gave me more opportunities to write, which gave me more virtuous circle all the way around. So I don't specifically regret spending a couple of years just in that experimental phase of throwing stuff to the wall on the internet and seeing what sticks. But if I got a do-over, would probably have been actively looking for, okay, you know, what is working? What do I enjoy writing? What fills a need for, I contemporaneously phrased it, what fills a hole in the internet? And there are holes in the internet, but there are some that are more valuable than others. It is extremely useful that the thing that happened to be my intersection of the Venn diagram happens to be extremely commercializable for well-heeled companies. Software companies in particular aren't going to run out of money to throw out the question of like engineering plus marketing software anytime soon. And so if I got a do-over, I would be looking at like, what are the opportunities that hit both my interests, my ability to write something well, and the expressed known needs of relatively well-heeled participants of the economy.
Yep. So how, like in network building, there's the famous chicken and egg problem. Like if there's a demand-driven marketplace, how do you actually get those first customers there? And there's a similar question within writing of when you were doing your bingo card maker, how did you get people to discover your blog at the beginning? Or maybe you can tell a story from Stripe. I know in the early days of Stripe, there was writing as part of the history. How should we solve the chicken and egg problem of online writing?
So one meta comment before we get into solving the chicken egg problem. I think too many people are paralyzed on the ability to write or the desire to write by saying like, it doesn't matter if I write if I don't have an audience to be able to ship those words to. And I think that even if you have literally 0 people who read what you write today, it is still worth writing that thing today because you will produce an asset that you can use in the future in one-on-one conversations. And this is 180 degrees from how most people think about audience building or writing online and playing for the numbers. But if the only thing you got out of writing an essay about whatever the topic is for you is that the next time you're doing a job search, when you are writing cold emails to hiring managers for whatever the position is that you're going after, you can use that one essay that you wrote back in the day as a proof of work on like, hey, I have clearly thought about this more than most people who are sending you a cold email with a link to a resume that you're gonna like skim for 30 seconds. And that would already be like the highest ROI on writing a piece that most writers will get. So I would not feel don't feel like you need to solve the chicken and egg problem prior to writing. That said, the chicken and egg like cold start problem is a real problem. Your audience exists somewhere, and it is likely a combination of both like, if you're solving this need that doesn't yet exist on the internet, it's probably a collection of people who don't yet know that they should be friends, but also some folks that are already friends or are already an audience elsewhere. And so if you find those places where your crowd or the people who should be in your crowd naturally congregates. Sort of participating in those spaces and then gradually injecting your stuff into those spaces works rather well. Too few people remember it, but there was back in the day this forum called The Business of Software that was hosted by Joel Spilsky, and there were yours truly and maybe 24 other people there that were building software companies all at the same time. And then if you use the magic math of participation on the internet, that implies that there were a couple of hundred people reading it. And a lot of those 24 people went on to do great things. And of the 60 people that read my blog on the first day that it existed back in 2006, I assume virtually all of them saw it because they had seen me participating on that forum for 6+ months. And so saw it when I posted hey, I started a blog today and I'm going to launch a piece of software in a week. Here's my post about it. The explosion of social media the last couple of years makes this easier because you can sort of like interact with people who have large audiences on social media. And then this is the tricky bit of it: gradually and in an authentic way, introduce your pieces into replies about their pieces, or your thoughts into replies about their thoughts. There's some deep social technology and nuance about doing that in a way that is both true to your values and not annoying for the person that you are sort of glomming onto, and also not annoying for their audience. But I've seen many people sort of do that and do that relatively well. And there was also, by the way, like people who affirmatively make space for that sort of thing. And I feel a little weird pointing at particular examples, but there are, well, I'll point at myself. I have a, sorry, one moment while I mute the phone. Have a standing invitation on my website that please send me email. I like getting email. I like reading things that people have written, et cetera, et cetera. There are other people who have like standing policies with signal boosting people who are new to the industry, et cetera, if you DM them on Twitter. And so if you wrote something that was relevant to an industry and you knew that folks like that existed, that might be a DM worth sending on Twitter. Or similarly, anyone with a podcast is typically looking for, well, an interview-based podcast. They're looking for more folks to interview, and there are both social reasons for them to want to vary the like career stage, et cetera, of the folks to interview, such that they will be willing to interview at least some relative unknowns. And there's also, in addition to social reasons, like that helps them with both availability concerns. It is a true fact that the same 100 people in whatever your neck of the woods is get quote unquote all the requests. Given that they have limited amounts of time, you can help people with filling holes in their schedule by saying, hey, I actually have an interesting take on this. Here's a proof of work that I've written that shows you about this. Would you like to have me on your podcast?
When it comes to this, like, I feel like you're hitting at something here between owned platforms and then like borrowed platforms. So you spend a lot of time on Hacker News. You were talking about the Joel Sapolsky platform earlier. So how do you think of, see, like there's two ways to sort of give this brash advice for writers, and I actually think that they're both wrong. The first is go publish on sort of the BuzzFeed model. We're just going to be everywhere, and we're not going to be collecting a lot of emails, and then we're just going to depend on these platforms for our own livelihood. That's the first model, and I don't think that's right. The second model is only write online, but then you struggle to get distribution, or only write on your own website, but then you struggle to get distribution. So how do you actually go on a Hacker News? How do you actually go on a Joel Sapolsky and then transfer that social capital into your own walled garden?
So interestingly, I think that people should probably have a slightly more detailed model of how their business works than it all being in a walled garden. We can talk about that in substantial amounts of detail, but suffice to say that you probably want to have something available which is a friend catcher that is accessible by anyone, and then an email gate which doesn't require payment, and then probably some paid products, perhaps out of the scope of this discussion. The I did consulting for a while, and consultants have this nice sort of mental model on what is the level of depth you go to in a coffee chat versus what is the level of depth you go to in a deliverable, and making sure that, like, coffee chats are free. You use that as it's a cost of doing business for you, just to get into conversations that could turn into potential engagements. Deliverables, on the other hand, are very not free, and the scope of them is committed to in advance. They have some features, and then the price is the price. When I'm writing on Hacker News, anytime I feel that a comment is becoming less of like an ad hoc, it's just me participating in water cooler discussion, and more of like, no, wait, I actually have something that there is a core of value here, and people would probably be referring to this for years if it had a permanent home. I make sure that the permanent home for that thing is my blog. Actually, my best blog, well, best according to the page views metric, and blog post ever was originally a Hacker News comment. It was John Graham Cummings wrote a blog post about his frustrations of being told his name was invalid. And there was a thread on Hacker News about this, and I started writing a comment of all the different ways that software got names wrong. And after I had 25 of them, like, this really should not be a Hacker News comment. And so flipped over to the blog, posted falsehoods programmers believe about names. This is back in 2010. It still gets name checked on Twitter 10 plus times a week. It has more citations in academic work than I feel is reasonably justified. And it's sort of like the canonical place people point to when someone, again, gets this frustration about, software has rejected my name, and now I feel a little annoyed / sad, which happens to me on a weekly basis because I have the last name McKenzie and I live in Japan, which definitely drove a bit of my heat when I was, pounding out this HN comment. And so when I do things like, tweet storms, et cetera, when I feel like, okay, my level of engagement in this tweet storm is getting over like the 15-minute mark, and there seems to be, some, I don't know, I won't say there's no actual thought that goes into tweet storms, but I'm like developing themes here and interlaying them against other pieces, and maybe like citing out to other work that has been done on this. I start thinking, maybe I should like promote this into a blog post. And typically I don't just like copy paste tweet storm into blog post and call it a day, but rather I use the tweet storm or the HN comment or that sort of thing to like, think out loud, if it were, do my best thinking by writing, and then go back into the cave, write up a real version, and then post that.
Tyler Tringus had a good question about the benefits of long form writing. You said earlier that your sweet spot was right around 8,000 words. And it does seem that you do prefer those long form essays. So when it comes to being online, and you said this to me a couple weeks ago, there are people who quite literally run the world, people who are the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, executives, and they'll wake up in the morning, they'll read a 10,000 word essay and dash right off to work. So Patrick, I thought that the internet was optimized for short posts, attention spans are falling, yada, 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 all these traditional narratives. What are people missing?
What are people missing? Incentive structures rule everything around me. So we could have a long discussion about this, but so much about the received wisdom of the art of doing the internet well is downstream of the incentive structures of large B2C advertising platforms and like large producers of inventory for B2C advertising platforms. And, not to pick on BuzzFeed, but since BuzzFeed is like widely acknowledged to be extremely good at exploiting this dynamic, like BuzzFeed has done a lot of research on what the cost curve for production of a listicle is versus the number of eyeballs it'll get if it has a attractive title on it, versus what the cost curve is for producing long form reporting, and how many people will stay on that long form reporting long enough to count as an impression for their advertisers. And the ROI trade-off for BuzzFeed is pretty clear. They want to have almost all of their work in an easy to consume, easy to share, preferably easy to share without even having to read it kind of bucket. And yet, like, most people in the world are not selling remnant inventory via an ad publisher. And if your goals are not selling a remnant inventory via an ad publisher, don't take advice from people whose writing habits have been optimized for that incentive structure. And so, like, what is my incentive structure from writing is an interesting and deep question. Like, you could probably draw, 100 people out of my professional network and say, there's like some curve of how much they like me, or believe that I'm sagacious, or believe that I'm capable of doing material work, and how recently has that impression been reinforced, and then what is the lifetime value of that relationship to me. And so I'm fairly certain that if I drew out that curve and then drew it out to, there's like some notion of core audience for me. I think I have somewhere on the order of like 80,000 followers on Twitter, and I bet of those 15 to 20,000 are my core audience. So maybe like extend it out to like 15K, and then extend it out to 80K, and then maybe extend it out to some penumbra of people who have like, oh, I know that Petty 11 guy from rumors from around the internet, but I wouldn't exactly call myself a fan. And I'm pretty sure that most of the weight in that curve is in the top 100. And so that if I'm being rigorous and optimal around it, the right form factor is whatever I can produce in in such a fashion that the top 100 like get more weight in the curve, and possibly like how do I do that while also continuing to expand the number of people who are in those like closer circles of the orbit, and increasing the aggregate value in those closer circles. But like, I'm not competing with BuzzFeed, not competing with the New York Times. I'm not even competing with most people who are engineers and write. Like, if you write about Docker, bully for you. Like the person you were writing for, and sort of the time that they would allocate to read the things that you were writing, don't come out of the same. It's not the same person. It's not the same bucket that my writing comes out of. And so, we're disjoint in the same way that Game of Thrones and I are disjoint. And that's not a value judgment, by the way. It's not even a value judgment on BuzzFeed, although I have some value judgments on BuzzFeed that I could share, but neither here nor there. You just have to understand who the audience is, what your goals are, what the incentive structure is for meeting those goals.
Well, let's just go there. How would you think about actually making those illegible structures legible so that you have something that you're at least oriented towards?
I think that Google Analytics is the best worst software that ever existed because of exactly that reason. What's the old saw that as soon as a measure becomes a target, it yada, 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 somebody's law. The
Goodhart's law.
Goodhart's law, thank you. As soon as people put things on a dashboard, it starts to recompile their decision-making process around it. And so you have to be very careful about what you put on a dashboard. And Google puts time on site on the dashboard because it's extremely easy for them to, well, it isn't actually extremely easy for them to measure, but it's measurable. Hits are measurable. Whereas, both for like privacy reasons and because there just isn't good data, who something affected, how deeply it affected them, and whether it affected them in a positive fashion, whether it caused them to change a decision they were going to make, and did that decision, like, did it swing a big door in their life? Google Analytics won't give you any of these things, but these are far closer to the sorts of impact that I think most people want to have. And the illegibility of gains, it comes in all over the place. I think it is one reason why people sort of systemically undervalue writing as a discipline. One of the things people say when they are citing, blogging is so over. There used to be all these great blogs, and then nobody blogs anymore. What happened to that? They're not realizing how effective blogging was for the people that were doing it. And a lot of people who were bloggers back in the day, like they didn't have a heart attack and keel over their keyboard while writing a blog post. They're still around and kicking it, and their careers have done things in the last couple of years. And often their careers have done things such that they are no longer considered like bloggers. And so, if I ask somebody like, okay, if you think blogging's dead and was not dead in 2010, who are your 5 top bloggers of 2010? And usually they have an answer to that question. I'm like, great, what's their job title right now? Like CEO, too rich to ever work again, CEO, senior staff engineer at Google, and et cetera. Like, the reason why they're not describing themselves a blogger anymore, it's because it's a massive downgrade over the thing that blogging got them to. Similarly, when people are thinking of incentive structures, I think a lot of folks would be surprised on the like raw numbers of how many people read my stuff. Like I do not run a media property as sort of numbers. I think first run essay from myself would probably get somewhere on the order of like 50,000 readers or so. And then granted, the best stuff from the archives sees a couple 100,000 readers every year for essentially forever, as far as I can determine. I have a post from 2012 about salary negotiation that did 500,000 readers last year. And so, presumably will be seen by many, many millions in years to come on the Google sites to take a whack at me. But those numbers, they don't adequately describe like the degree to which my habit of writing helped accelerate my 4 software businesses that I run. They don't adequately describe how it helped expose me to people that will both help with the Stripe stage of my career and the future stages of my career. And they I think they also don't describe like internal changes that I made. It might seem a little weird. Like you wouldn't say it's weird for someone to have an internal change as a result of going to a gym. I think there are some people who would think that it is weird to say that you have an internal change as a result of like doing push-ups before your brain. But I think that is probably descriptively accurate. So, it is probably better for me on net that I spent 10,000 plus hours writing versus spending 10,000 plus hours playing World of Warcraft or watching TV or something.
Yeah. So when you talk about 10,000 plus hours writing, what does your writing process look like? Because from what I've read about you, you are the kind of person who sits down on a Saturday morning and the entire idea has crystallized and you just bang out an essay and you don't leave your chair until that essay is basically done, which is the exact opposite of how I do it. And I know Tyler Cowan is also like a write everyday guy. You don't seem as much like a write everyday guy. So what is your process for stringing together ideas? And then I know that people are thinking this, but like, do you have a motivation issue, or like, how do you keep yourself disciplined, or are those even questions that you're thinking about?
So I'm all over the map on this. As someone who's talked to a number of great writers, and to throw out some names that haven't come up yet, but should. Matt Levine, he writes a column every day called Money Stuff, which is delivered over email and is sort of my North Star for when I grow up. I want to be able to write more like Matt Levine, Bernd Haubert, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody has their own process. Mine is substantially like you described with I'll say one thing, which is that prior to the Saturday where I spend 6 hours shackled in a chair writing like a man possessed, I typically am chewing over an idea for, on the low end, a couple of days, on the higher end, a couple of weeks. And it's a bit of an obsessive. And so it's a lot of like shower thoughts, which go everything from like, what are the angles that I could take in a particular piece, all the way to what are some anecdotes that I could bring in, maybe even like particularly good turns of the phrase. And then I don't sit down for writing like a man possessed until I'm pretty much decided on the angle. And I have like the rough structure of it in my head. And then please don't feel like you need to duplicate this anybody, because I know a lot of great writers don't do this, but I start at the top, I write until I get to the bottom. I do one reread for a structure to say like, on a paragraph by paragraph level, is this narrative like structured in the right fashion, or would it look better if I like moved this third of the essay up a little bit? Then do one more read on attempting to get less red marks from my sophomore English teacher, and then push go. That's when I can control the writing style and the timeline for the piece. I occasionally have been known to write for other people, or write in a professional capacity, and then sometimes there's other constraints like sign off from various other stakeholders, a deadline, which is a terrifying word for me. We have a business event happening on Tuesday the 27th, and then there is a production workflow which happens, and so we will need the words locked by whatever it is, the 15th, and so your words need to be ready by the 15th. That's the thing that happens. I attempt to make do with that. You asked about motivation. Given that I'm an obsession-driven writer, cultivating more intellectual obsessions causes me to write more. And so to the extent that I want to write more, which I generally want to write more, the thing that gets me inspired to do that is either having more conversations with people, much like this conversation, or reading more interesting things. And so more and more varied input leads to more and more varied output, at least with respect to yours truly.
Yeah, you once said that Ramit Sethi is like, for you, one of your all-time favorite marketers and one of the very best people at using the internet. And what the two of you have in common is you have a big regret of not using email sooner. What is it that people miss about email? Why is it important? And how should people think about growing their list?
So I will say that do what I say, not what I do. I don't have an active email list at the moment, which is a straight up missed opportunity. There's reasons for that. I'm quite busy between my day job and having two small children, et cetera, et cetera. And when I was evaluating life back in 2016, well, one thing has to get dropped. Probably shouldn't be either of those two things, or sleep. So maybe I should write a little less than I have previously outside of day job. But do what I say, but not what I do. Why email? So many thoughts here. One, email is something that you can own and that is very difficult to take away from you in a way that your presence on social media platforms, et cetera, is not. The people who have not just opted in is so overused in email marketing circles. Like folks who like really just stuck up their hand and said, yes, I want exactly what it is that you do. And I would like to get that in my life on a daily or weekly or whatever basis. Those folks are less likely to burn out on your stuff than the folks in, have an interesting relationship with Hacker News. There's a better than 50-50 shot that anything that I write will hit the top of Hacker News, which is an interesting cheat code for a writer to have. And yet, like partly as a participant in that community who doesn't want to see that community get stressed over a thing, and partly as someone who hates seeing negative stuff written about him on the internet, I'm sort of rate limited in how much I can write because, you know, most people on Hacker News did not come to Hacker News specifically to see my stuff. And so if my stuff was hitting the top of Hacker News on like a weekly basis or a daily basis, that would be too much. Whereas I feel far less reticence on like, if I told you, hey, sign up for this you know, daily newsletter, and I will give you a daily newsletter, which is probably not a great framing, but whatever, it's easy to understand. Like nobody who signs up for a daily newsletter from Patio 11 is going to be annoyed when on Wednesday I'm back in their inbox covering my usual beat. Like, you know, it did exactly what it says on the tin. And so being able to control the framing of what it is you offer, the cadence, the sort of like brand positioning of it is much higher with regards to email than it is in participation in forums and communities on social media, et cetera. You also have more control over both who gets your thing and in what way they get it. Theoretically speaking, your email can get forwarded to anybody, and that is a good thing for many people who write email because they, you know, forwarding to your friends is one way to grow your list. But there isn't really a culture of like forward a newsletter to a business associate to dunk on the newsletter in a way that there is definitely a culture in Twitter of like retweet with comment to dunk to a much larger audience. And so that changes the risk calculus, both like the psychic risk calculus and the, you know, extremely real, like career oriented risk calculus of like participating. And so you can, I think, participate a little more authentically with respect to writing email to a closed audience of people who have largely, they largely know you and you know, like what you're selling, quote unquote, versus writing on Twitter. And you kind of also always have to have in the back of your head, you know, a process running on, is this going to excite one of the many opposed internet outrage machines that are active on Twitter and cause me to have a really bad day? And that's very definitely something like I have to think about when writing on Twitter that I wouldn't have to think about when writing to my usual audience. And I know some great authors who write less than they would and write in a less impactful or pointed or true manner than they would, specifically because they're worried about you know, social media pylons, which seems like, on the one hand, incentives rule everything around me. I understand the thought process. That just seems like a bad way to live life. And to the extent that you put, you know, much of your writing output to your own email list and in your own spaces, you will get exposed to that downside risk less.
You have this quote that I really like, which is, you radically underestimate both how much you know that other people do not and the instrumental benefits of you publishing it. Why don't you talk about the arbitrage of knowledge here and all the things that people have built up ideas around that they haven't shared, but also there certainly isn't, like, there's a hierarchy here. So how can we identify which ideas are worth publishing and which ones are just noise?
What makes an idea worth publishing? I think that it's useful to understand that there's like an instrumental / use value for an idea. Will someone be able to take this technology, the idea that I've written down, and like replicate it in their own life? And that is not the only value that a piece can have, even though I think a lot of folks weight that particular value very highly. You know, your particular way of explaining something and whether that lands with a particular audience is another dimension of value, which is often underappreciated. Even like, I'll come back to that thought in a moment, your sort of persona or demographic information, et cetera, that would cause the idea to be accepted by people who might not accept it from another interlocutor. How do you pronounce that word? I've only ever seen it written. That is also like another dimension of value. And so there are widely more things that should be written down than actually are written down. Let's talk about that. This might not be a new idea, but it might be new to a particular audience. I've had relatively few new ideas with regards to marketing over the course of my career. I think I've only ever had one, actually, just the one. Most of the other stuff has been things that have been well known in the marketing community. But the marketing community and the engineering community don't talk all that much. A polite way of phrasing it is that engineers are for Mars, marketers are for Venus. A less polite way of phrasing it is that most engineers think that marketing is exploitative bullshit. And so a lot of what I've done over the course of my career is just explaining things that are well understood in marketing land, like A/B testing, in such a way that the culture that is engineering doesn't dismiss them. And then, like, hey, if you learned enough about marketing to be dangerous, you as an engineer, without having to turn in your coding badge, would have more organizational sway, get your projects approved more often, be paid radically more money, have a better career outcome, et cetera, et cetera. That isn't quite an arbitrage, but figuratively, I suppose, an arbitrage. And it's one that, you think people would catch on after me doing it for 10 plus years, that, hey, all I'm doing is like taking Seth Godin things and then putting put a Git analogy in there. But it works really, really well. And I think I have a tendency to be a little too self-critical and a little too self-deprecating. That's perhaps more self-deprecating than I should be. But there is a lot of repeated value in that and in hitting something at the intersection of two ideas. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. When you talk to good marketers, what do they still miss about what it takes to market well online? What is something that to you feels like this obvious secret hidden in plain sight that even the best people aren't understanding?
There's been a meme the last couple of years, like performance marketing is the future, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to rigorously measure the effect of our campaigns and double down on the ones that are winning, blah, 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 blah. I think that even given that, people's time allocation and their like relative amount of brain sweat allocation is often determined more by, their, what seems to be high status either for themselves or their organization, what feels fun, what feels like a good idea. I mean, like, Google did an art installation. What do we have planned for an art installation, et cetera, versus things that are actually winning. I think that caring about quality is surprisingly underrated, and not just doing something because, it was on our Q2 plan to get a podcast up and running, but like, what is the best possible version of the podcast? Podcast needs to have intro music because podcast needs to have intro music. Step back, what's the best possible version of the intro music, et cetera, et cetera. Like, just the appreciation of craft is something that is under indexed on. One of the reasons I love working at Stripe is that there is a great deal of appreciation of craft.
Talk about
caring
that.
more than the
Yep. I'm really curious to hear, because like Stripe does have an appreciation for craft, and I notice it from the second I walk in. Last time I went to Stripe HQ, the woman at the front desk, she had seen my photo. She greeted me by name when I arrived. And I was like, wow. Then to like, when I get lunch there, the lunch is fantastic. And then just talking to the people at Stripe and looking at your documentation and your design, there is like a level of craft that somehow Stripe has avoided some kind of reversion to the mean that infects all these different kinds of companies. And there's a lot of other companies, particularly in Silicon Valley, who get very influenced by what the data says, and you can see the quality of the product actually degrading over time because I think that they're too focused on metrics. And I wonder if craft and metrics are in some way opposed or in some way of a different language. And I'm wondering, what does Stripe do to maintain that love for craft and beauty and like care that goes into a product?
My instant spit take answer on this is it's ultimately a cultural question. And then I'm remembering a great line from one of the best books ever written about Japan, which is that when people say something is a cultural question, that means that they don't have a good structural explanation for it. And so carrying those two ideas in my mind in synthesis at the same time, there was one sense in the way that, and this is, by the way, certainly not a thing that we have achieved an asymptote at. I think that if you were to ask people in Stripe generally or senior decision makers, we would definitely say that we're not happy with where our quality bar is, either at any point in the past, in the present, not likely in the near future either. But be that as it may, how do you create a culture of like caring more than the other guy or caring more than the median in your industry? One is to like explicitly say and model to people, we care more, and we are willing to spike a launch over it not being the best version of the launch. That there are like mechanical ways to do this internally, such that you don't incentive systems rule everything around me. If you incentivize like hitting the schedule on time every time, will cause people to hit the schedule every time. If you incentivize shipping the best version of something, you will tend to ship the best version of something. Those are, two like caricatured ends of the pole, but you can sort of like choose where along that spectrum you sit, and we're relatively intentional on where on the spectrum we are. Being responsive to internal and external evaluations of whether something is good. A thing that we do very frequently is take, so interestingly, a thing that I do not do in my writing personally is to show writing to people prior to it being done. I mostly publish to the internet and everybody gets it at the same time. That would be crazy talk at work. We have multiple internal checkpoints where we show either other people internally or sort of like trusted outsiders, hey, here's an early version of an essay we're working on, or an early version of a landing page, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think? And there's often substantial amounts of rework in response to feedback, up to and including like, we are institutionally ready to say 8 people have worked on this new landing page for 6 months. And 5 out of 5 of the trusted feedback people hated it. All right, throw it away. We will start from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. And there are pluses and minuses to that. Believe me, like there's some very toothy internal morale management consequences to, thank you for doing that work for the last 8 months. We're going to throw it all away because it was bad, start over. We wouldn't phrase it as because it was bad, but that is definitely what people might feel if you tell them, oh, we're throwing away 8 months of your work. So, being willing to make those calls, being like willing to back people when they make those calls, being willing to back people up and down the organization when they say, hey, I'm not an original gangster Stripe. I just joined 2 weeks ago, and my role is not one that would normally have decision-making authority with respect to X. I'm actually, I do user operations, which is a support-oriented role at Stripe. But I've got some thoughts with respect to this artifact, and saying like, yes, we will listen to those thoughts, because when we gave you an employee badge, we were buying, access to your brain cycles, and we like those brain cycles. And making sure that you like increasingly get signal from the people that have been good at doing that over like previous iterations of the game, formally or informally. Does that answer the question?
Absolutely. So What is it about Stripe really talks about its writing first culture? And I think that you show it sort of a lot of the things that we do for marketing is presented as for outsiders, but in actuality, it's also for insiders. And with Stripe Press, a lot of what Stripe Press is, like with The Art of Doing Science and Engineering and Nadia Egpal's new book and Revolt of the Public, one of my favorite books of all time, actually, a lot of what Stripe is trying to do, I think, is raise the bar of thinking, both within Stripe and then extending out to Silicon Valley and then hopefully for the world. What is it about Stripe's commitment to writing, and what do you think the genesis of that is? What does writing so regularly do for a company?
So I'll make one observation, which is that we have a lot of words that are available on the internet via Stripe Press, via Stripe Increment, via the Atlas Guides, Stripe Blog, et cetera, et cetera. And that if you were to just do just by word count, and just by word count of long-lived documents, I think that upwards of 99% of Stripe word count would be internal rather than external. So granted, we have plus or minus 3,000 people working at the company, but the company's total available corpus is massive. What does that do for us? So for obvious reasons, I can't disclose things like the Stripe growth rate in terms of either business or in terms of head count, which is the way that typically describe the number of people working at a company. But say, hypothetically speaking, a lot of businesses some businesses on the venture trajectory go through a hypergrowth phase. And a company in a hypergrowth phase might be growing at or doubling their number of employees every year. And this has some implications which are not broadly appreciated. One is that if you joined in 2016, a company that is growing at 2x per year, the day you join, half of your colleagues will have less than 1 year of tenure at the company. 1 year later in 2017, half of your colleagues will have less than 1 year of tenure at the company. 1 year later in 2018, half of your colleagues will have less than 1 year of tenure at the company. Continues for the duration that you're on that hypergrowth curve. And so, given that your corporate existence is constantly largely weighted to people who do not have the context of having been there for a number of years, who are still getting spun up as members of the company. But while they are spun up, or you can't do work if half of your people can't do work. So while you are embodying the company culture and getting acclimated to how stuff is done, you're producing that culture at the same time. You need to have force multiplier on the sort of democracy of the dead. That's the traditional way to describe history outside of companies. Hopefully most of your prior employees won't have died yet. Be that as it may, reproducing the culture and amplifying the culture of people who were there before, who might be, numerically, what's the word? If you just go by the numbers, the people who have 4+ years of tenure will be a very small portion of your employee base if you're doubling every year. But the impact that they can have by producing highly leveraged artifacts extends for years, decades, et cetera, particularly when it changes the set point of the company culture and helps people build off of that set point in the future. So I don't remember where I was going with that answer. That.
Cool. That works. Well, I like the democracy of the dead idea. That is what writing is doing. It is saying from all these people who have been there before, as the company grows, you can still get their ideas. Actually, you could almost use a Bitcoin metaphor, that they are on the chain and they're there sort of permanently over time, even as you begin to add to the ledger over time. I want to shift into talking about software companies. I think that one of the ideas that I'm just ecstatically excited about is building an online audience, writing online, then through that actually validating demand and meeting people who could be future coworkers or future customers, future investors for your company. And through that, actually launching small software businesses. One of the things I want to do with my career is basically take hundreds of people through this path. I have the writing online path now, then end up having a place where people can grow their audiences together and then basically create some kind of Y Combinator for bootstrap software businesses. That's the path that I'm on. And so my question to you is, what have you seen in terms of validating these small software businesses and then the go-to-market strategy? Like, should we go to market once we have 100 email newsletters, 5,000 email newsletters, or is that not the parameter that we should be thinking about this at all?
Oh, interesting discussion. So scoping it to B2B SaaS companies for the moment, because B2B SaaS is the kind of software that I know the best. As time goes to infinity, every B2B SaaS company will say, thump head, we should have a content marketing engine. And every content marketing engine will eventually publish a book, either like an actual book or something which is morally equivalent to a book based on word count, degree of intellectual depth, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing that I would suggest most people do is to pull the content marketing forward and sort of like write the book before writing the software, if that makes sense. And why? One, when you think of like the production functions of books versus software, it doesn't have to be a book. It can be an ebook, blog, et cetera, but broadly, resequence the usual sequence of deliverables. If you were going to start a software company, you're pot committed into doing it eventually anyhow. If you do it earlier, it's quicker to get up and running on the internet and quicker to get something worthy of the attention of others up and running on the internet. So you get to start the clock on things like Google giving your domain some authority. You get to start the clock on things like social amplification via social media, on attracting people to your banner, on getting newsletter subscribers, et cetera, earlier. And those things tend to compound over time, both time that there's a distinction between wall clock time, like the amount of time that you are sitting at your desk periodically looking up the clock and doing the work, and calendar time, just some things like Google authority take just a while to bake, regardless of whether you're like physically hands on the keyboard during it. And if you sequence those activities earlier, you get to have more opportunities to go through the learning loop, more opportunities for value to compound over a longer period of time versus sequencing them later. If you spend 9 months in the code cave building out version 1.0 of your software and then launch to nobody, that's 9 months where you could have developed a newsletter with thousands of people subscribing to it, and then 9 months after that, with relatively little additional work done on the newsletter, had like people ready to buy your thing on the first day. So that is the first thing I would suggest, is like rethink the mindset of becoming a software person who writes, and think more about like becoming the expert and then writing the software that that sort of like encodes your expertise in the software product. I think that really writing deeply about how you understand whatever your problem domain is will make your software product decisions better. I think the company that brings this into sharp relief is Basecamp, and Basecamp the product as well. But if you look at their Jason Fried recently did a 30-minute video just taking you through product decisions for Hey, which is this new upstart email client. Like there's a fascinating document just on like great product thinking, and a lot of that is like great thinking of the job to be done of email and how people use email in terms of like workflows and what situations it fits into in their life. And a lot of people, if they like just start from a software perspective of, okay, I need to write a workflow engine for throw my own products under the bus. Appointment management for dental offices. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to need to have like some way to create customers for this and some way to like create appointments, and I'll need some calendar grid and yada, yada, yada. If I were to resequence the order of operations in that company and say, okay, no, first I'm going to thoroughly dive into the challenges that dental offices have with regards to appointment management and what that does in their business, that would like cause me to think much more deeply on like, what is the sociology around changing an appointment time? What are the sort of events that cause customers to cancel? How do you get ahead of those events? How do dentists get appointments in the first place? Was something I had no understanding of when the first day that appointment reminder opened for business, which would have been a useful thing to know. And so like building software that you've put in your brain push-ups and have a theory of the mind of how the user will use it, will tend to create better software and also give you more marketing assets to start marketing and selling the software on day one. So that is some of the things that I would suggest on folks that are going from that transition from writing about something to building a software product that instantiates it. I'll also say like the level of work you have to do to create the minimum viable saleable software product is relatively high relative to the level of work that you need to do to create the minimum viable sellable Word product. And the interviews with industry experts become a totally sellable ebook in under weeks of work, and it would be extremely difficult to have a modern SaaS app that was baked enough for production use within weeks of work. And yet you can get people to pay you $50 for interviews or for an ebook that describes your method or any of a number of other artifacts that are primarily writing. And that both like money is a nice thing to have. It allows you to buy things that are useful and accelerating the success of your business. Also rent, cool thing. It also trains people to pay you money with regards to the subject that you have. So the second time you ask them for much more money, you're not getting them over the penny gap again. It's like, well, I paid this person $50 for an ebook, which I read about the subject. They seem to know what they're talking about in that ebook. Now I will do the additional work of pushing them through the whatever the process is at my company for greenlighting a new software product versus like, do we really want to have a discussion with like the security team on getting this approved? Is that worth my time? Do we want to put this software trial through its paces, et cetera, et cetera? You're sort of like pre-answering sales objections via producing a written artifact that they can actually buy versus going directly into selling them a software-based artifact.
What is, you had a thread about Zero Down a couple months ago. What is a small software business that you admire, and talk about how they use online writing and content to actually grow and validate the business? It'd be really interesting to get an example of some of the things that you're saying, and it'd be even better if it's a company that we haven't heard of, because I think that proves the point well that you like to say that the amount of money that's flowing through capitalism would astound you. And I think that the reason why I love that is it's so the inverse of how a lot of us grow up. Oh, there are 6 main jobs that you're going to go into. It could be investment banking, management consulting, accounting, yada, yada, yada. But I think that what I've taken from you quite a bit is actually the number of options available to you is way bigger than you think. And give us an example of what you mean by that.
So somebody who is not me coined Art McGannigan, is a colleague of mine at Stripe, but he's left 2 other adventures, coined Patio Levin's Law, and which is funny, like no endorsement implied, but I think he's probably right on this. He said that the number of software businesses in the world is larger than you think, even after you've taken into account Patio Levin's Law. And so there's tens of thousands of extremely healthy software/SaaS businesses, which you've never heard of and which most people will never hear of. And they will, like, the business will be born, it will successfully satisfy customers, it will grow for years, it will get sold, and at no point will it ever be legible to someone who is not a customer or employee of it. And Stripe has sort of a privileged vantage point on this Some people who are investors or business brokers have privileged vantage points on this. I've been obsessed with this topic for many, many years. Just like take this from faith that when you think of like, legible examples, even legible examples from yours truly of somebody who has, a firm that has done the writing to bootstrap a business thing and done well by doing that. The best informed person that could tell you about examples like that is only scratching the surface of how many people who have used that tactic successfully. That said, Basecamp is often thrown out as as an example here, and I think far too many people say, well, Basecamp is internet famous, and so that isn't a replicable strategy. But Basecamp is internet famous because they had no blog, then they had a blog, and they continued writing for that blog for a while. And internet famous is just the past tense of wrote a blog for 10 years. ConvertKit is another example. ConvertKit is a company by Nathan Barry, which does email marketing for writers. I think they have a different definition than writers, but I would probably say writers, creators, et cetera, et cetera. And they, that was an outgrowth of Nathan's own efforts he wrote a series of ebooks for the design community, ebooks and other information-oriented products for the design community. And then he wrote one book about the business of doing training products called Authority, and said that the marketing and sales engine behind training products tends to be heavily email-oriented. And so Authority talked a lot about like the tactical use of email. And then he was like, I should really build the email service that would exist if somebody was making an email service specifically for people who were following this playbook that I just wrote. And so that eventually became ConvertKit, and ConvertKit is doing fabulously well. And yet, ConvertKit is in some quarters internet famous. There are companies that are less internet famous. I'll throw out an example. MoreAware makes, it makes essentially an ERP for kitchen countertop installers, which is a section of the U.S. economy. And if you've never installed a new countertop in your kitchen, you might be underestimating price points. But suffice it to say that a lot of money happens in, middle-class homes around kitchen remodelings. Who knew? And so there is a large, heavily distributed industry of mostly mom-and-pop businesses that have some extremely difficult planning and resource management questions around if you don't buy the right amount of granite at the store and it is not cut into the right amount of shapes, you're going to get to the kitchen and be extremely sad because physics and math will impose upon you the impossibility of delivering the kitchen table you've contracted to deliver. And so shouldn't you use more software than you have previously? And so MoreAware is that software, and they do quite well for themselves. And for anything that you can think of that is I don't think that kitchen countertop installation is the platonic minima of the size of business that you need to be to support a software business. There are multiple competing viable software businesses in cemetery management, not funeral management. That's an entirely separate industry. Just laying out cemeteries and ensuring that that somebody can manage the sales process for them, the maintenance process for them, et cetera, et cetera. Throw a dart at the dartboard of the economy. If it hits a business that has a W-2 employee in it, that business will at scale consume billions of dollars of software. And there are many, many, many fractal ecosystems upon ecosystems of companies that are selling into these businesses. And so it is a wonderful, wonderful time to be alive in software.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you. You've lived in Japan for a long time now. What is the number one thing that you would like to export from Japanese culture in terms of tacit knowledge of what we can learn from, whether it's Japanese craftsmanship, engineering, culture, elegance, music? What is it?
It's a very complicated question. I'll say as a person with the East Asian Studies degree, I'll have to give the disclaimer that there is no one Japanese culture any more than there is one American culture, and that the degree of homogeneity of Japan's culture is largely overstated. That said, it's also not the case that there is no such thing as an American culture. So some broad themes. A thing that exists in pockets in the United States and exists at more than pockets in Japan is a level of earnestness and optimism with respect to one's work. I think that is broadly a healthy attitude for society to have, and one that I wish we replicated more broadly. I think Silicon Valley gets close to this in a lot of places, although the sort of like learned cynicism of the U.S. Educated classes has started to infect Silicon Valley in some ways. But I'll give you an anecdote, not that the anecdote is representative of the whole, but I once met a man at a mall in Ogaki, Ogaki being the town that I lived in. And he was there at a crafts fair in the mall. And his craft was sharpening scissors, not making scissors. That's a different company. He was just the scissor sharpening guy. And he had spent 40 years of his life getting darn good at sharpening scissors. And he talked to me for 45 minutes about the craft of sharpening scissors, his argument for why no household should have less than 3 pairs of scissors, because you can keep scissors in like different states of sharpening. And like clearly, like you would never use a fabric scissors on paper. Well, you wouldn't want a sharp cut. I'm not using the right words, but like you would want one pair of scissors for sharp cuts on paper and one pair of scissors for more rough cuts on paper. Like clearly you would not use these 2 things in the wrong place. Why would you do that? And just like the level of passion he had about sharpening scissors defeats the level of passion most people have, not just for most things, but probably for anything. And like a culture that has created a space where someone can say, without a trace of irony, I have devoted my career to being the best possible sharpener of scissors, is doing something right. And like non-ironic embrace of just loving what you do that feels like a free lunch that the US and various other places could import from Japan. And there are many cultural, socio-political, et cetera, reasons why when someone says, I non-ironically love what I do for a living, why sophisticated people in positions of authority would say, oh, well, that's just what the capitalists want you to believe. But like loving what you do is a superpower, both with respect to increasing your ability to do what you do well, and also get results out of what you want to do well, get better at what you want to do well, and just being like happier with life, such that all else being equal, choose to love the thing that you do. Like that is a choice available to you, which interestingly is not the same advice as choose to do what you love. I think the advice choose to do what you love is generally bad advice, because that will cause more people to want to be like professional World of Warcraft players, and the market demand for World of Warcraft players is like lower relative to the market demand for whatever the heck my job title is right now. So I'm all else being equal, I'm happy that I sell software for a living and don't play World of Warcraft for a living.
So talk about that. So within selling software for a living, I don't imagine that when you were 5 years old and maybe you went off to your first day of kindergarten, that when somebody asked what you wanted to do and all your friends said, I want to be a baseball player, I want to be a ballerina, I want to be a firefighter, I can't imagine that you said, I want to sell and be the foremost world expert on how to sell niche subscription as a software service software products. How did that love evolve from being a kid to then now developing a love for the craft and the dedication that you bring to your writing and to your work at Stripe?
So yeah, it would have been a singularly interestingly calibrated 5-year-old to say, I want to be a niche software sales expert. I was an interestingly calibrated 5-year-old. My actual answer was I wanted to be the commissioner of weights and measures. But choosing the road less traveled since 1987. So I sort of, and not to make this too much of the tell stories from years past hour, but I fell backwards into the thing that I'm doing right now. Sort of like continuing to travel up that gradient of whatever you find yourself doing, find the parts of it that you like and double down more on those parts that you like, and on the parts that, are in that fun intersection of the things that you like, things that you're good at, things that people want from you, and things that they, the world is willing to pay for. But continuing to travel up that gradient has worked reasonably well for me over the years. There is, as someone who is in a career situation for plus or minus 6 years where I was not enjoying what I was doing, and I was sort of like intellectually aware on any given Monday morning, I'm going to do something that I affirmatively dislike today. And that's kind of on me, because I could, make a choice to not do this or not have to do this for next Monday morning, but I avoided making that choice for, again, 6 years of my life. Life's too short. Make obvious improvements perhaps earlier than I did, and if not, next Monday's a new day. If you're not loving what you're doing right now, either figure out the parts of what you're doing right now that you can love, or figure out ways to alter your situation such that you can be doing things that you enjoy more, or that you can make yourself enjoy more. I think people underestimate the ability that they have to change, and particularly to change the way that they look about things. One of the interesting parts about the Stripe culture is Stripe hires for people who are ambitious, and Stripe hires for people who are optimists. And being around a lot of ambitious optimists tends to make you both more ambitious and more optimistic. And one would think that one's level of resting state level of optimism, resting state's level of ambition is relatively constant over the course of your life. And having 15 plus years of experience on this, I would say actually no. I think one is surprisingly able to just become more ambitious, or to just say, starting now, I think I'm going to be more ambitious than I was previously. And so the Silicon Valley rational set would say self-modify, recompile your own code to be more X, recompile your own code to, what you do more is an option available in the solution set, and perhaps you should do that. And if you find yourself doing something that's no, just fundamentally incompatible, the thing that I do for work is not something that I will ever love, consider changing that.
Last question. You once said, and I think this ties everything that we've discussed together, and I've taken this to heart, that the amount of luck that you have in life is how much value you create times how many people you tell about it. Why don't you wrap this conversation up in a bow tie by explaining what you mean by that?
Let me give a shout out to the TechZing podcast, which first articulated that idea to me, and their framing for it was the luck surface area. By the way, TechZing made their own luck by putting a name on that piece of advice, and then by getting into my ears such that I just told you about the TechZing podcast, and 99% of you have probably not heard about it. Observation out of the way. It is too easy to hide your lamp under a bushel, or whatever the cliche is, to think that I'm just going to do the best work possible and I will naturally be rewarded for that. And the world is not set up to reward people just for doing great work. There's an incentive structure around you. There are decision makers around that who will largely not be apprised of the value you're creating unless you make it your mission to also apprise them of the value of that. At the same time, being a professional like social media influencer in the topic of influencing people seems to be like a way to undercreate value versus actually doing something which produces value for the world, and then promoting the fact of that value creation versus just promoting the fact of promotion. Unless you're a PR professional, I don't know. And so you sort of have to balance both ends of this. And you also have to kind of, this is another thing where, recalibrate your own understanding. I am a very modest person. I was raised in an environment where one is heavily discouraged from tooting one's own horn, et cetera, et cetera. I think I've talked to a lot of people from various personal and professional backgrounds where that's the case. I come from a community where self-promotion, quote unquote, is heavily discouraged. Self-promotion is kind of like self-cooking. If you don't do it, and you don't pay somebody to do it, and you aren't family with somebody who's going to do it for you, then you're going to go hungry. So like understand that you probably need to consider that to be one of your professional skills, and that you probably need to get good at doing it. And there's good ways to do it. There's less good ways to do it, but that's something which is ultimately going to fall on you. Similarly, like you're going to probably, if you are employed by someone, you're going to need to own your own career advancement versus expecting like management to decide based on your contributions, et cetera, that you are ready for that next step. Like, hopefully they will be doing that too, but have a written record available, which is ready to show them the great value that you've created, have actually produced that great value, and be advancing that conversation forward periodically. So yeah, broadly take ownership over your own outcomes, over the various different facets of creating the value that you'll create in the world. Optimize for creating more value, and optimize for doing it over a very long arc of your career. And things will, knock on wood, tend to work out for you.
Patrick McKenzie, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. That was just a wealth of incredible knowledge. So just for all of you who are here, I'll be hosting a workshop on Friday called How to Write Online. So we'll just put the link in the chat. So if you want to sign up, that'll be on Zoom. It'll be 1 hour long, and we will get this up as a YouTube video and email it to you tomorrow. Patrick, thanks again. It's always a treat to chat with you.
Thanks very much for having me. And if I can ever help anybody on anything, my email address is patrick@kalzumeus, KALZUMEUS.com. I started using Hey, the new email thing recently. So if you email patty11@hey.com, hey, HEY.com, that'll reach me. I always love getting email from folks, so hit me up.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate all of you coming today and spending an hour and a half with Patrick and I, and we'll see you on the internet. Bye, everybody.
Thanks very much. See you around.